The gala moved like a living thing. Crystal chandeliers threw gold across the walls, and the room breathed in the particular rhythm of money, slow, deliberate, unhurried by anything as ordinary as consequence. Every suit was a declaration. Every gown was a statement. And at the center of it all, Dame Sunhai moved like the room had been built around her specifically, like the marble floors had been laid to carry the sound of her heels, like the other guests existed only to frame her presence. She smiled at people the way royalty smiles at monuments, acknowledging them without truly seeing them. Along the perimeter of the room, the invisible people worked. Penelope Travis was one of them. Black uniform, white apron, tray balanced at shoulder height with the kind of effortless precision that nobody in this room would ever think to notice. She kept her eyes at the middle distance, not down, not meeting anyone's gaze, just floating somewhere between acknowledged and forgotten. She had practiced this, the art of erasure. After everything that happened, she had gotten very, very good at it. Nobody here knew her name. Nobody here knew that 2 years ago, her face had been on billboards. That her hands, currently carrying appetizers for people who would never learn her name, had been on championship posters in 16 countries. She moved quietly, table to table, room to room, ghost work. Then came the moment. One step miscalculated. A slight shift in weight. The tray tilted by a fraction, and a single measure of red wine traced a perfect arc through the air and landed in an elegant bloom across the front of Dame Sunhai's white gown. The music didn't stop, but something did. Sunhai didn't scream, didn't gasp. She simply went very still, the way dangerous things go still right before they move. Then she turned, slowly, the way a camera rotates to find its subject, and looked at Penelope with an expression that had no heat in it at all, which was somehow worse than rage. She smiled, and the room understood immediately what kind of smile it was. If you love stories about power, dignity, and the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed, you are exactly where you need to be right now. Hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and tap that like button, because this story is about to go somewhere they never saw coming. Are you Team Penelope? Let me know below. Now let's get back into it. The silence that settled after that smile had weight to it. The conversations nearby didn't stop all at once. They tapered, like a signal losing strength, until the space around Penelope and Sunhai existed in its own contained quiet. Guests shifted, not away toward. This was the entertainment now. Penelope stood exactly where she was. This was the thing that nobody in this ballroom understood yet. Stillness for Penelope Travis was not submission. It was assessment. From the time she was 19 years old training in a gym with no air conditioning in the Philadelphia summer heat, she had learned that the fighter who moves first from panic loses. You read the room. You read the body. You identify the threat level. You decide. She had decided. Sunhai stepped forward, closing the distance between them with the slow confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation she couldn't control through sheer social architecture. She studied the stain on her gown the way a surgeon studies a problem, clinically, without urgency, with the implicit understanding that whatever came next was entirely her choice. "Do you have any idea," she said softly, "what you've done?" Her voice was quiet. That was the craft of it. In a loud room, quiet commands attention more completely than volume ever could. Penelope kept her eyes level. "I apologize for the accident, ma'am. I'll arrange for the dry cleaning immediately." No tremor, no over-explanation, no cascade of apologies designed to perform contrition for the room. Sunhai tilted her head. That was the second thing people noticed. Every server in her experience had started folding by now. Folding was the expected choreography, the apologies stacking on top of each other, the visible distress, the gratifying proof that the hierarchy was intact and understood. Penelope wasn't folding. She was standing with her weight distributed evenly across both feet, shoulders relaxed, hands loose at her sides. The tray was still balanced in one hand without a tremor. Sunhai recognized something, even if she couldn't name it, a quality in the stillness that didn't match the uniform. She circled. You learned things about people when you circled them, when you invaded their space from different angles and watched how their body responded. Sunhai had refined this into an art form over years of navigating the particular social warfare of the world she'd married into. Penelope's body said nothing she hadn't chosen for it to say. "People like you," Sunhai said, addressing the room with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime treating public spaces as personal stages, "become careless when no one is watching closely enough." She stopped directly in front of Penelope, reached out, lifted Penelope's chin with one finger in the gesture that was designed to strip a person of whatever they were holding onto. She looked into Penelope's eyes. And for just a fraction of a second, Sunhai paused. Penelope's eyes were calm, not the glassy calm of someone suppressing panic, not the practiced calm of someone performing composure. Something else, something that lived deeper than expression. The eyes of someone who had been in far worse rooms than this one. The eyes of someone who had been down and gotten up, been counted out and kept going, been robbed in front of millions and survived the silence after. Sunhai's finger lowered slowly. "How long," she asked carefully, "have you been working events like this?" "Long enough," Penelope said. A ripple moved through the nearest cluster of guests. Not because the words were provocative, they weren't. Because they were complete. No apology trailing behind them. No qualifier softening the edge. Just the answer, clean and final. She wasn't serving drinks. She was observing threats. Sunhai's expression rearranged itself into something colder. She reached out and lifted the tray from Penelope's hand, examined it with studied curiosity, then let it tilt, slowly, until a glass slid free and detonated against the marble floor with a sound that cracked through the entire ballroom like a starter pistol. The guests flinched, then laughed, the laughter of people relieved to know which side they were supposed to be on. "How careless," Sunhai said, voice gentle with satisfaction. "Clean it up." She stepped back and her chin dropped just slightly, the specific geometry of the instruction she was about to deliver. "On your knees." The room went sharp and still. Penelope looked at the broken glass on the floor, looked at Sunhai. Then she crouched, smooth, unhurried, with the controlled economy of someone whose body knew exactly what it was doing at all times, and began gathering the pieces with careful, precise hands. She moved without humiliation in her posture. And that was when the room started to understand that something was wrong with this picture. That the woman on the floor wasn't behaving like someone being broken. She was behaving like someone waiting. From across the ballroom, on the far side of the room, where the shadows were deepest and the angles were widest, a man stood with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Sang Doo-ho watched the woman in the server's uniform gather broken glass from his fiancée's performance, and something behind his eyes shifted with the quiet precision of a calculation completing itself. He had seen fighters his entire life. He had funded them, managed them, bet on them, and buried the ones who lost badly enough. He knew the specific quality of a body that had been trained to survive punishment and return fire. The maid didn't flinch. He set down his glass. The rust was falling off. The hands that had held a championship belt still knew exactly how to shatter a man's defenses, and Sang Doo-ho had just realized he was looking at the most dangerous investment opportunity in the room. The gala didn't wind down so much as it exhaled. Guests thinned gradually, the way tide pulls back from shore, slowly, then all at once. The orchestra reduced itself to a pianist finishing out the evening alone. Champagne flutes collected on abandoned tables. The architecture of the event, which had felt so total and consuming 2 hours ago, revealed itself now as exactly what it had always been: temporary staging for people who needed an audience to feel real. Penelope moved through the breakdown rotation with the same economy she'd brought to every hour of the evening. Stack, clear, reset. The physical rhythm of it was almost meditative. And she had learned to live inside that rhythm, to let it take up the mental space that thinking too hard about her life would otherwise occupy. She was consolidating the last section of tables near the east corridor when she became aware of the shift. Not a sound, not a movement she could specifically identify, just a change in the atmospheric pressure of the room the particular quality of air that preceded being watched by someone who was very good at watching. She had felt it before, in training camps and pre-fight corridors. The sensation of being studied by someone who understood what they were looking at. She didn't turn immediately. She finished stacking the glasses, deliberate, unhurried. Then she turned. Sang Doo-ho stood 8 feet away. He wasn't accompanied by security, which she understood immediately was its own statement. Men who traveled everywhere with protection used its absence as a specific kind of signal, that this conversation was chosen, not procedural. That whatever was about to happen, he had decided it would happen this way. He was younger than she'd expected from a distance, mid-30s. The suit was the kind of understated that cost more than the conspicuous kind. He held nothing in his hands. His posture was the posture of someone who had long ago stopped needing props to fill silence. He looked at her with the specific attention of someone completing a calculation rather than beginning one. "Penelope Travis," he said. Not a question, not an introduction. Just the name placed in the air between them like an object set on a table. She held his gaze, said nothing. 41 professional victories, he continued in the same quiet register. 32 by stoppage, WBC lightweight title 2021, unified belt 2022. A brief pause. Wrongful disqualification November 2023. Corner stoppage officially cited. Footage reviewed by 3 independent analysts, all of whom concluded the referee made a call that had no technical basis. Another pause, shorter. All 3 analysts retracted their statements within 30 days. The room had gone fully quiet around them. The last of the staff had filtered into the back corridor. The pianist had finished. It was just the 2 of them and the chandeliers still burning overhead, indifferent. Penelope kept her face neutral. It cost her something. Not much, she had practiced this particular expense into affordability, but something. "You've done your research," she said. "I did my research 14 months ago," he said. "When I first started trying to understand why a fighter with your record was no longer fighting." He didn't want a servant, he wanted a legend. If this story is already pulling you in, you're not alone. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss where this goes. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. The best stories deserve the best audience, and you're clearly it. Now let's get back to the room. Penelope set the tray down on the nearest table. Slowly. Not from nerves, from the specific kind of deliberateness that buys thinking time without advertising that you're buying it. "Whatever you think you know," she began. "I know you have the original recording," he said. She went still. Not the practiced stillness of the ballroom earlier. Something more fundamental than that. The stillness of a person whose private architecture has just been accurately described by a stranger. Sang Doo-ho's expression didn't change. The referee feed, not the broadcast cut, the raw officiating footage that the commission claimed was corrupted in the system transfer. The copy that was supposed to not exist. A measured beat. "You've had it since December 2023. You've shown it to 2 journalists and a sports attorney. All 3 went quiet inside a week." The chandeliers hummed faintly above them. "Who are you?" Penelope said. "Someone who finds the Sports Commission's behavior over the last 18 months extremely interesting," he said. "And someone with the particular resources to make that interest consequential." She studied him the way she studied everything, looking for the mechanism underneath the presentation. Every person who had approached her in the last year and a half had wanted something that cost her and paid them. The journalists wanted a story with her face on it. The attorney had wanted a case that would eventually settle quietly and make him visible. Nobody had wanted justice. Justice was expensive and unphotogenic, and it didn't close cleanly. "You're a mafia boss," she said, direct, without theater. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the acknowledgement of someone who respects precision, among other things. "Then whatever you're about to propose," she said, "the answer is no." "You haven't heard it." "I don't need to hear it. I know the shape of it." She reached for the tray. "Men like you don't invest in people. You purchase them. I've been purchased once already by an industry that dressed it up as opportunity, and I spent 18 months cleaning office buildings while they cashed the checks from the fighter they replaced me with. I'm not interested in a different version of the same transaction. She picked up the tray. Sasha Vreeland is fighting for the unified belt in 9 weeks, he said. Penelope stopped. The promotion is already structured, he continued. The venue is booked, the broadcast deal is signed, and the same commissioner who oversaw your disqualification is on the oversight committee for the bout. He let that land. Without external intervention, that fight happens without you, the belt stays where it currently sits, and the recording you've been carrying for 18 months remains exactly as useful as it's been so far. She didn't turn around. The tray was in her hands. The corridor was 12 feet away. With external intervention, he said, the political infrastructure holding that outcome in place becomes significantly less stable. Certain relationships become complicated. Certain financial arrangements become visible to people with the authority to act on what they see. He paused. The fight card has room for a co-main. The promotion adds it when the right pressure is applied to the right locations. You walk back into the octagon on the largest card of the year, in front of the same audience that watched them take it from you, and you finish what they interrupted. A contract written in blood. Penelope turned. She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she read opponents from across the octagon, before the cage door closed and everything became geometry and consequence. Looking for the tell, the lean, the shoulder that dropped slightly before the combination came. His posture gave her nothing. And what do you get? She said. The belt under my banner, your fights, managed through my organization for the duration of the contract, promotional rights, exclusive training facility access, and the satisfaction of watching a system that was designed to be unbreakable develop a very public crack. He held her gaze without effort. I'm not interested in owning you, Ms. Travis. I'm interested in owning the outcome. There's a meaningful difference. Not from where I've been standing. From where you've been standing, he said. You've been invisible, deliberately made invisible by people who understood that your continued visibility was a threat to a structure they'd spent considerable money building. He tilted his head by a degree. I'm offering you visibility, on your terms, inside a framework I control with a specific and contractually defined endpoint. You reclaim the title. The contract expires. You walk away with your legacy intact and their corruption documented in a format they can't retract. A pause. Or you keep clearing tables. The pianist had left. The catering staff was finishing in the back. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, the city moved through its own indifferent business. Penelope was quiet for a long moment. You watch the footage, she said, the raw cut. 3 times. Then, you know what the referee did wasn't a mistake. It was a precise professional service rendered in exchange for a specific payment, he said. Yes, I know exactly what it was. Something moved through her chest. Not emotion, exactly. The physical response to 18 months of carrying a truth that nobody with power had been willing to acknowledge out loud. The specific relief and rage of finally being accurately seen. She didn't let it show. I want the recording protected, she said. Independent custody. Not your organization, not my hands, a third party with the agreement that it goes public automatically if anything happens to either of us or the deal. He considered this for exactly 2 seconds. Done. I choose my own training staff. Your facilities, my people. Reasonable. The contract has a ceiling. Title fight, Title 1. Contract complete. No extensions, no options, no renegotiation leverage built into the language. My attorney will draft it tonight. I'll have someone review it who isn't connected to you, the UFC, or anyone who's touched my career in the last 5 years. Take the week, he said. She studied him one more time, the full assessment, every variable she could access from where she stood with what she had. The comeback starts here. I haven't said yes, she said. No, he agreed. You haven't. She picked up the tray, walked to the service corridor, pushed through the door, let it swing shut behind her. In the kitchen, the remaining staff were finishing the breakdown around her, and the industrial overhead lights were the hard, honest, unglamorous light of the real world after the chandeliers went dark. She set the tray on the counter, stood with her hands flat against the steel surface. 41 victories, 32 stoppages, one theft dressed up in official language and filed correctly and buried under the signature of a commissioner who had been paid to make sure nobody dug it back up. 9 weeks. Sasha Vreeland in the co-main of the largest card of the year, fighting for the belt that had been physically removed from Penelope's waist in a corridor after a decision that 3 analysts had confirmed and then swallowed. She looked at her hands on the steel counter. These hands. The door to the corridor opened behind her. One of the other servers moved past without looking up, carrying the accumulated debris of an evening built entirely on performance. Penelope straightened, untied her apron, folded it with the same precise, economical movements she'd brought to everything tonight, and set it on the counter beside the tray. She walked toward the exit. Her jaw was set. She hadn't said yes, but her hands already knew the octagon doesn't lie, and those hands had unfinished business with a belt that was wearing the wrong name. She didn't sleep that night. Not insomnia exactly, more like her mind had decided that sleep was a luxury the current situation hadn't earned yet. She lay on the narrow bed in her apartment, staring at the ceiling with the particular alertness of someone whose nervous system had received information it wasn't finished processing. The city moved outside her window in its usual indifferent rhythm. Somewhere down the block, a bus pulled away from a stop. A dog addressed something in an alley. The radiator knocked twice and went quiet. Sang Duho's words sat in the room with her like a third presence. 9 weeks, Sasha Vreeland, the same commissioner. She closed her eyes. And the arena came back. It always started with the sound. Not the roar of the crowd, that came later. It started with the specific frequency of 40,000 people holding their breath simultaneously. A sound that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite noise, that lived in the space between anticipation and detonation. She had learned to use that sound as a calibration tool, to breathe inside it, to find her center inside the suspended moment before the cage door locked and the world reduced itself to geometry, timing, and consequence. November, the MGM Grand, the unification bout. Penelope remembered the walk. The tunnel had smelled of concrete and electrical equipment, and the particular charged air of a building operating at maximum human capacity. Her coach had been talking in her left ear, reminders, technical cues, the practiced language of preparation, but she had been somewhere beyond language by then, in the state that the best fighters learned to find and the rest spent careers chasing. The place where the body was fully present and the mind had stepped back to let it work. She had been ready. Objectively, measurably, undeniably ready. She had studied Sasha Vreeland for 4 months, watched every recorded round of her career, not just the highlights but the fatigue rounds, the moments when the conditioning frayed and the real fighter underneath the game plan became visible. She knew Vreeland's tells, the right shoulder that dropped 2 centimeters before the overhand, the way her footwork shortened when she was hurt, the habit of reaching for the clinch when her combinations weren't landing clean. She had built an entire fight around those details. The first 2 rounds had confirmed everything. Penelope had been dismantling her, not dramatically, not in the highlight reel way that filled arenas with noise, but in the surgical, systematic way that judges noticed and opponents feared. Controlling distance, timing the counters, accumulating damage with the patience of someone who understood that a fight was a longer argument than most people realized, and that being right consistently mattered more than being loud occasionally. By the middle of the third, Vreeland's left eye was swelling. Her output had dropped by a third. She was surviving on instinct and a corner team that kept telling her she was still in it. She wasn't still in it. The ref smiled as she went down. Here's something most people never get told about professional combat sports. The officiating system has almost no independent oversight at the elite level. Referees are licensed by state athletic commissions. Those commissions are funded in part by the promotions they regulate. The financial relationship between the regulator and the regulated isn't a secret, it's structural. Which means that when a promotion has a preferred outcome for a title fight, The infrastructure for delivering that outcome already exists inside the system that's supposed to prevent it. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a documented conflict of interest that reform advocates have been raising for over a decade, and that the industry has been successfully ignoring for just as long. Remember that. It matters for what comes next. And subscribe, because this channel doesn't just tell you what happened, it tells you why. The stoppage came in the 4th round. Penelope had taken a right hand, clean. She wouldn't pretend otherwise. It landed, and it landed well. And she had gone to a knee. Standard knockdown. The kind of moment she had been in before and recovered from before, the kind of moment her conditioning had been specifically built to survive. She remembered the canvas under her glove. The cold clarity that came with impact, the brain's emergency sharpness that cut through the pain and assessed the situation with brutal honesty. You're down. You're not done. Get up. She was already pushing back to standing when she heard the referee's voice. And something in the cadence of it was wrong. Not the words were correct, the procedural language of the 10 count. The cadence, the rhythm, it was too fast. Not rushed with urgency, but fast in the specific way of someone performing a count they had already decided the ending of. She had watched enough fight footage to know the difference between a referee managing a knockdown and a referee executing a script. She got up at 7. Clearly, completely. Both feet under her, hands up, eyes tracking, weight balanced, the full physical vocabulary of a fighter who was present and functional and absolutely entitled to continue. The referee looked at her and stopped the fight. No standing 8, no examination, no glove tap to confirm responsiveness, just the arms crossing, the wave off, the immediate physical interposition of his body between her and Vreeland with the smooth efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the motion. They stole the crown. The arena noise changed in a way she had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. A sound that wasn't disappointment or celebration, but something genuinely confused. The crowd's collective intelligence registering that what they had just witnessed didn't match the footage their eyes had actually captured. She remembered standing there with the referee's back to her, processing the information with the detached clarity of concussion-adjacent shock. This is happening. This is actually happening. Vreeland's team was already flooding the cage. And then she saw it, the thing that lived in her memory with more fidelity than anything else from that night. More than the referee's wave. More than the commissioner's voice on the microphone. More than the title belt being carried to the wrong corner. Sasha Vreeland, in the chaos of her team's celebration, turned. Just once, just for a fraction of a second, in the specific direction where Penelope was standing motionless in the center of the cage. And she smiled. Not the smile of a competitor who had survived a war and won on the edge of defeat. Not relief, not euphoria, not the complicated joy of a hard-earned outcome. Something else. Something that already knew. Something that had been waiting for this moment with the specific patience of someone who understood that the result had been arranged in advance and was only now becoming official. That smile lived in Penelope's chest like a coal that never fully cooled. She had filed the formal appeal within 72 hours. The commission had acknowledged receipt and gone quiet for 6 weeks, then issued a 3-paragraph response citing, reviewed footage consistent with referee's assessment, and no grounds for reversal. Signed by the same commissioner who had been photographed with the promotion's CEO at a private dinner 4 days before the fight. Penelope had that photograph. She had a lot of things. The 2 journalists she'd approached had been interested. Genuinely, visibly, professionally interested, until they weren't. One had stopped returning messages after a week. The other had called her directly to say that his editor had pulled the story citing insufficient corroboration, which would have been more credible if the editor hadn't been on the promotion's media advisory board. The attorney had lasted longest. 3 months of consultations, document review, a formal demand letter that the commission had responded to with a legal team that billed more per hour than Penelope made in a month at the diner. The attorney had settled, quietly, on terms that required her to sign a non-disclosure that she had refused, which meant she'd walked away with nothing except her refusal intact. Justice was just a word, until now. She opened her eyes. The ceiling of her apartment, the radiator, the city outside doing its indifferent work. She sat up, reached under the bed frame where the floor met the wall and found the hard drive by touch, small, matte black, the size of a deck of cards. She held it in both hands in the dark the way you hold something you've carried so long it's become part of your weight. The raw officiating footage was on here. 47 minutes of uncut referee feed from a camera angle that the broadcast had never aired, capturing the cage from a position that made the timeline of her recovery unmistakable. Frame by frame, the record was clear. She was standing, responsive, and entitled to continue fighting at the precise moment the stoppage occurred. 3 analysts had confirmed it. 3 analysts had then recanted under pressures she could infer, but never fully document. She had been carrying this drive for 18 months, like a verdict waiting for a courtroom. Sang Doo-ho had described it accurately in a ballroom without ever having been given access to it, which meant he had sources inside the commission's infrastructure, which meant the machine she had been pushing against alone, with journalists and attorneys and formal appeals, was something he moved through the way water moves through architecture, finding the gaps, applying pressure at the right angles, going where the resistance wasn't. She set the drive on the mattress beside her, looked at her hands. 41 victories, 32 stoppages, a referee's premature wave-off and a rival's knowing smile and 18 months of invisibility that had been designed, constructed, and maintained by people who understood that her visibility was a financial threat to an arrangement they had invested heavily in protecting. 9 weeks until Sasha Vreeland defended a belt she hadn't legitimately won. In a venue that would hold more people than had witnessed the original theft. On a broadcast that would reach every market where Penelope's face had once appeared on a billboard. She picked up her phone, found the number she had been given at the end of the evening, written on the back of a card that had no name on it, just digits, in the clean handwriting of someone who expected to be called. She held the phone. Outside, the first gray suggestion of morning was beginning at the edge of the sky. The city was shifting registers from night to early, the specific transitional hour that belonged to people who had made decisions and were now living in the first moments of their consequences. Her thumb moved over the screen. The belt was waiting for its owner, and somewhere across the city, a mafia boss was already awake, already patient, already certain she would call before dawn. The car arrived at 5:43 in the morning. No markings, no driver introduction. The man behind the wheel wore a dark jacket and the specific expression of someone professionally committed to not having a face, and he didn't speak for the entire 40-minute drive except once, at the beginning, to confirm her name. She watched the city transition outside the window, the familiar geography of her neighborhood giving way to industrial corridors she didn't recognize, then to a district of warehouses and gated lots that existed in that particular urban category of places nobody visited without a specific reason. The vehicle stopped in front of a building that announced nothing about itself. Concrete facade. No signage. A loading dock that hadn't been used for loading in some time, converted now to an entrance with the kind of security infrastructure that cost more than the building appeared to be worth. A man she didn't know scanned a card and held the door. She walked in and stopped. The Mafia had the best equipment. That was the first coherent thought. Not strategic, not cautious, just the pure, involuntary response of an athlete walking into a facility that had been built by someone who understood that performance infrastructure was not a luxury, but a variable with direct consequences on outcomes. The space ran the full interior length of the building. The ceiling had been raised or the floor excavated. She couldn't tell which, to create clearance that belonged in a professional training center, not a converted warehouse in an unmarked district. The lighting was the calibrated full-spectrum kind that eliminated shadows without creating glare, the kind that cost 4 times the standard installation and reduced eye fatigue over long sessions. The floor was competition-grade matting throughout, with a full-size cage at the far end and a boxing ring adjacent to it, both regulation dimensions, both in condition that suggested regular professional use. The equipment wall ran 30 feet, heavy bags in graded weights, speed bags at adjustable heights, reflex equipment she recognized, and some she didn't, the kind that came from specialty manufacturers who sold to national team programs rather than commercial gyms. The conditioning section had machines she had only used at 2 other facilities in her career, both of which had been funded by major promotional contracts. She walked the perimeter slowly, reading the space. A voice came from the direction of the cage. "You're 2 minutes late." She turned. The woman leaning against the cage door was compact, somewhere in her mid-40s, with the build of someone who had been athletic for so long it had simply become structural. Close-cropped hair. Tape on both hands, old and worn from a morning session already completed. She was looking at Penelope with the flat, evaluative attention of someone who had assessed a great number of fighters and had long ago stopped being impressed by anything except actual evidence. "Nadia Reyes," the woman said, not extending a hand. "Former WBC super featherweight, current conditioning and striking coach for this facility." A beat. "Mr. Duho said you were a UFC champion." "Was," Penelope said. "That's what we're here to determine," Nadia said. "Whether that's past tense or just a temporary condition." She pushed off the cage. "Warm up, full dynamic sequence. I want to watch you move before we discuss anything else." The rest was falling off. Not immediately. Not cleanly. The first week was a reckoning of a specific and humbling kind. The confrontation between who she had been and what 18 months of survival mode living had done to the physical instrument she had spent her entire adult life building. The cardiovascular base was salvageable. Waitressing and cleaning and the general physical labor of 3 jobs had kept her aerobic foundation from collapsing entirely. And by the 3rd day of conditioning work, she could feel it responding to the stimulus with the reliability of something that had been dormant rather than destroyed. Everything else required negotiation. Her hands were sharp. They had always been sharp. The technical precision of her striking was the thing about her game that was most deeply encoded, the last thing that degraded and the first thing that returned. Within 4 days, Nadia had stopped correcting her combinations and started building on them, which was its own form of professional acknowledgement. The lateral movement needed work. The cat quickness that had made her such a difficult target at her peak, the ability to make distance disappear and reappear in fractions of a second, had softened at the edges, the neural pathways slightly overgrown from disuse. She drilled footwork patterns for 90 minutes each morning before anything else. Cone sequences and mirror drills and lateral band work until her ankles ached, and the movement started coming back in the clean, automatic way it was supposed to. Her wrestling had atrophied most significantly. She had always been a striker first, had won 32 fights by stoppage on the feet, but at the elite level, a fighter without functional grappling defense was a fighter with a visible ceiling, and Nadia had identified this within the first week with the blunt diagnostic efficiency of someone who wasn't paid to be encouraging. "Your takedown defense is a problem," she said, on day 6, after a sparring session that had illustrated the point in concrete terms. "Not a crisis, a problem. Problems have solutions." The solution arrived on day 8 in the form of a grappling coach named Tors who communicated almost exclusively through demonstration, and had the disconcerting habit of catching submissions from angles that shouldn't have been available. He was methodical, patient, and completely unmoved by her frustration, which she expressed exactly once and then put away because frustration was expensive, and she was operating on a tight timeline. She was faster than before. This was the discovery that came at the end of week 2, and it arrived without announcement. She was running a combination sequence on the heavy bag, the specific 4-strike pattern she had built her finishing game around, the sequence that had ended 11 of her 32 stoppages. And somewhere in the middle of the 3rd repetition, she felt the timing snap into a register that was not restoration, but improvement. Nadia, watching from 6 feet away with the stopwatch she kept perpetually in hand, said nothing. But she clicked the watch and looked at the split, and something in her expression recalibrated by a fraction. "Again," she said. Penelope ran it again. "You're generating the hip rotation earlier than you used to," Nadia said. "It's shortening the telegraph on the cross by about 40 milliseconds. She paused. "That's not a trained adjustment. Your body made that on its own." Penelope understood what that meant. The nervous system, given rest after years of continuous high-level stress, had used the enforced downtime to consolidate. What had felt like 18 months of deterioration had been, underneath the surface-level degradation of conditioning and timing, a period of neurological refinement happening without her knowledge or permission. Her body had been working even, and she hadn't been able to. She hit the bag again, felt it again, the clean, sharp, ahead-of-itself quality of the combination landing before the conscious mind had fully finished deciding to throw it. Muscle memory at its deepest level doesn't forget. It waits. The facility operated on a schedule that suggested she wasn't the only person using it, though she rarely encountered anyone directly. Occasionally, she arrived to find equipment recently used, mats with the specific compression patterns of recent grappling work, the faint evidence of sessions that had ended just before hers began. Duho's organization moved through the space the way it moved through everything, efficiently, without unnecessary visibility, leaving just enough trace to confirm activity without providing information. She had been there 11 days before she saw him. He appeared at the observation level above the main floor, a mezzanine she had noticed, but assumed was storage, and stood at the railing with his hands in his jacket pockets watching her spar with Nadia's designated hitting partner, a former regional champion named Watts who was big enough and skilled enough to make the rounds genuinely productive. She didn't acknowledge him during the session, didn't adjust her work for the audience. When the round ended, she looked up once, directly, holding the gaze for a moment that established she had known he was there, and then looked away and pulled her mouthguard for the rest period. When she came off the floor an hour later, he was waiting near the equipment wall. "How is it going?" he asked. "Ask Nadia," she said, unwrapping her hands. "I did," he said. "She said your hands are ahead of schedule and your grappling is a month behind where it needs to be." Nadia is accurate. She usually is. He watched her work the tape off her left hand. "There's a development you need to know about. The commission has moved the fight card timeline forward by 10 days. Her hand stopped. "The broadcaster requested an earlier window," he said, "scheduling conflict with another major property. The promotion agreed because the promotion does what the broadcaster pays them to do." A measured pause. "You now have 19 days instead of 29. She looked at him. "Tor says the grappling defense can be functional in 19 days if the volume increases," Duho continued. "Nadia says the striking is already above the required threshold. The conditioning gap closes in 10 days at current trajectory." He said all of this with the flat, informational delivery of someone presenting a brief rather than a crisis. "It's manageable." "It's 10 fewer days." "Yes." She finished unwrapping her right hand, folded the tape with the mechanical precision of someone keeping their hands occupied while their mind worked. 19 days. Sasha Vreeland, who had spent the last 18 months training under the full financial and logistical support of a promotional machine that had invested heavily in her continued success. Vreeland, who had a full camp, a full team, the full legitimacy of a champion's preparation. Penelope had a building with no sign on it, and a grappling coach who'd caught her in a rear naked choke 4 times in a single session yesterday, and seemed to find this motivating rather than discouraging. She looked at the cage at the end of the room, the way the lights hit it, the geometry of it, the angles, the distances, the specific mathematics of a space she had spent her life learning to own. "The octagon doesn't lie," she said quietly, to herself more than to him. Duho said nothing. He understood the difference between a statement that required a response and one that didn't. She turned toward the corridor that led to the recovery room, already calculating the evening session in her mind, the adjustments Tors had recommended, the defensive sequence she needed to drill until it stopped requiring conscious initiation and became reflex. "Travis," Duho said behind her. She stopped, didn't turn. "Sunhai knows you're here," he said. "I don't know yet how." The corridor was quiet. The cage at the far end stood in its clean, indifferent geometry under the full-spectrum lights. She started walking again. She didn't need their permission, but Sunhai knowing changed the clock on everything, and 19 days was already not enough time for the war that was now coming from two directions simultaneously. Damn, Sunhai did not make mistakes. This was the central article of her self-conception, the load-bearing belief around which everything else in her interior architecture had been constructed. She had grown up in a household where errors were not corrected but punished, where the distance between acceptable and unacceptable was measured in her father's silences rather than his words, and she had learned early that the only reliable protection against those silences was the elimination of anything that could be called a failure before anyone else had the chance to name it. She had carried this forward into adulthood with the discipline of someone who understood that the world she had chosen to inhabit, the world adjacent to Sang Duho, the world of real power rather than its performance, had no tolerance for the improvised or the careless. She had survived in that world for 6 years by being precisely what the environment required: composed, intelligent, strategically patient, and ruthless in the specific quiet way that left no fingerprints. She did not make mistakes. What she had made, apparently, was an underestimation. She had found out about the facility on day 9. Not through Duho. He had said nothing, offered nothing, continued moving through their shared life with the same contained, unrevealing quality he brought to everything that fell outside the category of what she needed to know. This was not new. He had always maintained those internal walls with the consistency of infrastructure rather than choice. She had long ago accepted the walls and focused instead on learning to read what moved behind them. What moved behind them lately had a quality she recognized and despised. Attention. The specific, calibrated, investor-grade attention he brought to things he considered significant. She had noticed it the night of the gala. The way his gaze had tracked the server in the plain uniform with the patience of someone identifying an asset rather than observing an incident. She had noticed him set his whiskey down. She had noticed his security contact afterward. She had filed all of it with the silent, meticulous efficiency of a woman who understood that information collected quietly was worth 3 times information pursued directly. 9 days of careful inquiry through channels Duho didn't monitor because he didn't know she'd built them had produced the address of the building, the name of the coach, and the broad outline of the arrangement. A former UFC champion, a title fight, a contract structured as an investment. The Viper was striking. She had sat with this information for 48 hours before moving. Patience was her primary weapon, and she did not waste it on reactions. Then she had made 3 calls. The first call went to a sports journalist named Whitfield who covered combat sports for a publication with genuine reach and a reputation for the kind of investigative credibility that made stories stick. She had cultivated Whitfield over 2 years for no specific purpose, because loose relationships with people who trafficked in information were assets whose value was impossible to predict in advance and foolish to neglect. She didn't offer him the full picture. She never offered anyone the full picture. She offered him a thread. A source close to the UFC's sanctioning process had information suggesting that a disqualified former champion was preparing an unauthorized return attempt, potentially backed by parties with significant legal complications. Off the record, unattributed, enough to initiate an inquiry that would, once it made contact with the Commission's infrastructure, produce its own momentum. The Commission's infrastructure still had people in it who had been involved in the original decision. Those people had reasons to ensure that the original decision remained unquestioned. A journalist asking questions in the right places would make those people nervous. Nervous people with authority made preemptive moves. Preemptive moves closed doors. She wasn't trying to destroy Penelope Travis. Destruction was visible, and visibility created accountability. She was trying to complicate the path back to legitimacy until the timeline collapsed under its own friction. The second call went to a woman inside the promotional office who had been exchanging favors with Sun Hai for 3 years and understood the terms of those exchanges with the clarity of a formal contract. The instruction was simple. The co-main slot that was being quietly held for a late addition to the card needed to disappear from consideration. Scheduling conflicts, contractual complications, the specific language didn't matter. The outcome did. The third call she didn't make by phone. She handled it in person, at a restaurant where the corner table in the back had the particular acoustic privacy of a space designed for conversations that didn't exist. The man across from her had worked in athletic commission oversight for 11 years and had, at various points during those 11 years, made decisions that Sun Hai held documented evidence of. Their relationship was not friendship. It was architecture. She told him that questions were coming. She told him to be ready to characterize any inquiry about the November fight as closed, reviewed, and final. And she told him that her continued silence on certain matters remained contingent on his continued usefulness. She left the restaurant, got into her car, and told the driver to take her home. 3 moves, clean, targeted, unattributable. The kind of play that didn't announce itself until the consequences arrived, by which point the origin was impossible to trace. She did not make mistakes. The boss's world is always watching. Du-ho's head of intelligence was a man named Ren who had the unremarkable appearance of someone specifically engineered to be forgotten in a crowd, and the professional habits of someone who understood that the most important information was always the information nobody thought they were generating. He placed the summary on Du-ho's desk at 7 in the morning, 4 days after Sun Hai's third call, and stood with the patient stillness of someone who had learned not to editorialize. Du-ho read the document once, set it down, read it again. "All 3, he said. Whitfield received the tip on Tuesday. He made contact with the commission press office on Wednesday. The slot conversation happened inside the promotional office on the same day as the restaurant meeting." Ren paused. "The timing is coordinated." Du-ho was quiet for a moment that had the specific quality of very controlled displeasure. "The commission contact," he said. "Handle the Whitfield thread first. I want a source closer to his editor than she is. The slot situation resolves through the broadcaster directly, not the promotion." He set the document aside. "And find out exactly how she located the facility." "Already working on it." "Travis needs to know," Du-ho said. "Not everything, enough." Nadia delivered the information with the same flat economy she brought to technical corrections. Between rounds, holding the mitts, while Penelope's breathing settled from the previous sequence. "Someone leaked to a journalist. Commission is circling. The fight slot is under pressure." She raised the mitts. "Du-ho is managing it. You focus on what you can control, which is this." She couldn't afford to be sloppy. Penelope hit the left mitt, then the right. Then the combination, the full 4-strike sequence, the one that had been arriving 30 milliseconds ahead of itself since week 2. "Who leaked?" she said between strikes. "Above my pay grade," Nadia said. "Hands up again." She knew anyway. There was only one person in Du-ho's immediate orbit who had both the motive and the operational intelligence to run 3 parallel plays simultaneously without leaving a direct trace. The same woman who had circled her in a ballroom with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation that didn't eventually resolve in her favor. Sun Hai hadn't thrown a punch. She had done something considerably more dangerous. She had moved against the infrastructure of the comeback itself, targeting the pathway rather than the person. It was sophisticated. Penelope could recognize sophistication even when it was aimed directly at her. She hit the mitts harder. "Channel it," Nadia said without sympathy. "Don't spend it." The thing about a coordinated campaign of quiet obstruction was that it required the target not to know it was happening. Visibility was its weakness. Once the moves were mapped, they became navigable not easily, not without cost, but navigable. The journalist's source could be undermined. The slot could be secured through a channel that bypassed the compromised one. The commission contact could be reminded that the leverage Sun Hai held over him was not the only leverage in the room. Duho's organization moved through these complications with the practiced efficiency of a machine that had been solving exactly these categories of problem for years. Within 72 hours, Wren's report confirmed. Whitfield had been redirected by his editor, who had received a conversation from someone with a longer relationship and a more significant story to offer at a later date. The slot was secured through a broadcaster-level conversation that the promotion had no standing to override. The commission contact had gone quiet. Sunhai's 3 moves had been answered. But the Viper was striking, and Penelope understood, in the particular way of someone who had been studying threats her entire career, that 3 answered moves didn't mean the engagement was finished. It meant the opening exchange was over and the real fight was beginning. She requested a meeting with Duho on day 16. He came to the facility, which she had learned was not his standard practice. He typically communicated through intermediaries and arrived only when the information required his physical presence. The fact that he came without being asked twice told her something about how he was reading the situation. "She's going to escalate," Penelope said. They were standing at the edge of the main floor, the cage at the far end of the room behind her. The indirect approach didn't close the door. The next move will be more direct. "Yes," he said. "Do you know what it is?" "Not yet." She looked at him steadily. "Can you find out before she makes it?" "That's a different question than the ones I'm accustomed to being asked," he said, a beat. "Usually people ask me to respond. You're asking me to preempt." "Responding is how you lose ground," she said. "I've been responding for 18 months. I know exactly where it leads." Something in his expression shifted, the same fractional recalibration she had seen once before, in the ballroom, when she had met Sunhai's gaze without flinching. The recognition of a quality he had assessed theoretically, now confirming itself in direct evidence. "I'll look into it," he said. She nodded, started toward the corridor. "Travis," his voice carried the particular weight of information being delivered carefully. "She knows about the hard drive." Penelope stopped walking. The facility hummed around her, the climate control, the lighting, the quiet mechanical infrastructure of the best-equipped training space she had ever worked in. All of it suddenly very far away. "How much does she know?" she said without turning. "Enough to understand what it means if it becomes public," he said, "and enough to know that making it disappear would remove your most significant leverage against the commission." She stood in the corridor entrance. The hard drive was in a fireproof case in a location that only she and Duho's independent custodian knew. That had been a condition of the contract. That had been the thing she had insisted on above everything else because she understood that without the recording, she had a comeback story but not a case. Without the case, the win meant nothing beyond the belt, and the belt without the acknowledgement of what had been done to take it was just metal. "She punched at the door, she punched at the slot, she punched at the commission," Penelope said quietly. "And now she's telling us she knows where the foundation is." "Yes," Duho said. 3 days left before the fight. They underestimated her twice, but Sunhai wasn't underestimating her anymore, and a threat that knew exactly where the foundation was buried had just become the most dangerous thing in the room. The press conference was scheduled for 11 in the morning. By 9:15, the media holding area outside the venue had more bodies in it than the promotional team had planned for. Penelope could see them through the tinted glass of the vehicle as it moved through the building's service approach. The cameras, the recorders, the specific organized chaos of a press corps that had received information and arrived early to stake position. Someone had leaked the announcement ahead of the embargo. In this industry, someone always did. She sat in the back seat in the plain dark jacket she had selected specifically because it photographed without distraction, and watched the crowd through the glass with the flat assessment she brought to everything that constituted a threat variable. Beside her, Duho's communications coordinator, a precise, unhurried woman named Cecilia who had managed 3 world championship announcements and approached press management with the temperament of an air traffic controller, was running through the final logistics in a voice calibrated to be heard by Penelope and no one else. 14 confirmed outlets. 6 additional unconfirmed who received the leak and came anyway. The promotion's rep will open, hand to the athletic director, hand to you. Prepared statement first, then floor questions. Time limit is 20 minutes, hard stop. I pull you out regardless of where the room is. And if they ask about the disqualification directly, Penelope said, your statement addresses it. You don't elaborate beyond the statement. And if they push? Cecilia looked at her with the expression of someone who had already planned for this variable. Then you say what we rehearsed, and you say it once and you move on. You're not here to relitigate. You're here to announce. A beat. The litigation comes later, in the octagon. The vehicle stopped at the service entrance. The ghost had returned. The room had the specific energy of a space where the official narrative and the actual story were openly in competition with each other. The promotion's representative, a man whose entire professional posture communicated the discomfort of someone managing a situation he hadn't fully chosen, opened with the language of excitement and opportunity, and the particular vocabulary of combat sports promotion that transformed every inconvenient reality into a compelling storyline. Penelope stood at the side of the stage and listened to him describe her return as one of the most anticipated comebacks in the sport's recent history, with the detached observation of someone watching a performance in a language she understood but no longer spoke. When her name was called and she walked to the podium, the room's noise changed registers. Not applause exactly, though there was some of that from the back, from the outlets that had been covering her career before the disqualification and had not entirely accepted the official version of its ending. More than applause, it was the specific sound of a large group of people recalibrating simultaneously, the sound of a room updating its understanding of what was actually happening. She looked out at them from behind the podium and said nothing for a moment. Not from nerves, from the deliberate use of silence as a framing device, something she had learned not in media training, but in the cage, where the stillness before the first exchange established terms that the entire fight would then negotiate. She let the room settle into the quiet she'd created. Then she spoke. 18 months ago, a decision was made in this sport that ended my run at a title I had earned in front of 40,000 people and across 14 countries of broadcast. That decision has been officially reviewed, officially upheld, and officially closed. She paused. I'm here to officially reopen it, not through appeals, not through press statements, through the only language this sport has ever actually respected. She let that sit. I'm fighting Sasha Vreeland for the unified belt in 3 days, and I intend to be very clear about what I think of the outcome that put that belt in the wrong hands. The room detonated. They thought they finished her. The questions came in the overlapping, competitive cascade of a press corps that had more to ask than the format allowed. Cecilia, positioned at the left edge of the stage, was already tracking the clock with the expression of someone prepared to be unpopular on schedule. The first questions were procedural. How was the fight sanctioned? Who had approved the slot? What was the commission's position? Penelope answered each one with the clean, sufficient economy she had rehearsed. Duho's legal and political work over the preceding weeks had cleared the formal pathway with enough thoroughness that the procedural questions had procedural answers, and she delivered them without elaboration. Then a reporter near the center of the room, young, with the specific alert quality of someone who had done genuine preparation rather than relying on the wire copy, asked the question that the rest of the room had been building toward. Ms. Travis, there are reports that your return has been backed by parties with significant interests outside of combat sports. Can you speak to who is funding this camp and what their involvement means for your independence as a fighter? The room went very attentive. Penelope looked at him directly. My training has been funded through a private investment arrangement with terms that are contractually defined and publicly registerable. My independence as a fighter is the same as it has always been, contingent on what I do inside. The cage, not on who writes the checks outside it. A measured pause. I'd also note that the promotion backing my opponent has financial relationships with the same commission that reviewed my disqualification. If we're discussing the relevance of outside interests to athletic outcomes, I'm happy to have that conversation at length. The room's energy shifted again, the particular shift of a space where the intended subject of scrutiny has successfully redirected the scrutiny. The reporter nodded slowly and wrote something down. 2 questions later, the one she had been waiting for arrived from the back of the room, delivered by a veteran combat sports writer whose byline had appeared on coverage of her original disqualification. Sasha Vreeland's camp issued a statement this morning. Do you have a response? Cecilia's eyes moved to Penelope. Penelope had read the statement at 7 that morning. It was 4 paragraphs of promotional language dressed as competitive confidence, concluding with a single sentence that had been written with enough precision to indicate professional authorship. Some decisions, once made, cannot be unmade, and Ms. Travis would be better served accepting the sport's official findings than pursuing a narrative that serves her personal interests rather than the integrity of the competition. It was a good sentence. Whoever wrote it understood that the most effective attacks were the ones that inverted the moral framework, that positioned the person seeking justice as the threat to institutional integrity rather than its victim. She had thought about it for 45 seconds, and then set her phone down and gone to eat breakfast. I've read it, she said now. I thought it was well written. A pause that the room filled with its own anticipation. Sasha Vreeland is a capable fighter who has held a belt for 18 months. She has trained hard, competed professionally, and built a legitimate following. None of that is the issue. Her voice stayed level, unhurried. The issue is how she came to be holding it in the first place. And in 3 days, in front of everyone who was watching 18 months ago, she and I are going to have the most honest conversation this sport has allowed us to have. She stepped back from the podium. Cecilia moved. The look on her rival's face was worth it. She knew this because Vreeland was in the building. Penelope didn't know it until she was being moved through the corridor behind the stage toward the service exit, Cecilia on one side and a member of Duho's security on the other. And the door at the far end of the corridor opened, and Sasha Vreeland walked through it with her own team around her. En route to the separate media availability that the promotion had scheduled with the studied innocence of people pretending the timing was coincidental. The corridor was not wide. The 2 groups stopped. The security on both sides did the immediate geometric calculus of the space and came to the same conclusion simultaneously, that there was no clean way to route either party around the other without someone yielding, and that the question of who yielded was not a neutral one. Penelope looked at Vreeland. Vreeland looked at Penelope. 18 months collapsed into the specific density of a hallway moment that both of them understood was not private, was already being clocked by every set of eyes in the corridor, and would be dissected and described and interpreted before either of them had finished walking away from it. Vreeland was taller than she appeared on screen, built with the rangy, economic athleticism of a natural athlete who had been well coached. Her expression was the careful neutral of someone who had been media-trained to project composure in exactly this kind of ambush moment. But there was something underneath it. Something that Penelope recognized because she had last seen it in a cage, in the moment after a wave-off, on the face of a fighter who had just received a result she had been told to expect and was now managing the specific discomfort of being seen by the person she had received it from. Not guilt exactly. Not quite. The awareness of a debt. Penelope held the eye contact for a long, unhurried moment, not aggressively, not with the performed intensity of a fighter selling a rivalry for cameras, just steadily, with the same quality of presence she had brought to the ballroom, to the podium, to every room where someone had expected her to look away first. Then she walked forward. Vreeland's team shifted. Penelope moved through the space between them with the contained economy of someone who had measured the corridor and her own body and the geometry of passage, and had decided that yielding was not among the available options. Their shoulders passed within 6 inches. Neither of them spoke. She heard Vreeland's team exhale behind her as the distance opened up. She didn't look back. Outside, the service entrance opened onto a side street where the vehicle was already positioned. She got in. The door closed. The city moved past the window in its usual indifferent register. Cecilia was already on her phone in the front seat, managing the downstream consequences of the press conference with the efficient calm of someone for whom consequences were just the next agenda item. Penelope sat in the quiet of the back seat. 3 days. She thought about the corridor, about the expression underneath Vreeland's careful neutral, about the specific quality of a debt that had been accumulating interest for 18 months and was now, finally, approaching its payment date. Her phone lit up. A message from a number she didn't recognize, no name, just digits, the kind of number that existed for a single use. The hard drive custodian has been contacted, not by us. She read it twice. Looked up at the city moving past the window. Sun high. The fight was in 3 days. The press conference had just announced to everyone with a stake in the outcome that Penelope Travis was back and was not interested in the official version of events. And someone had just made a move against the one piece of evidence that turned a comeback story into an undeniable case. The price of betrayal is a heavy one, and Sun High had just made the kind of move that told Penelope exactly how afraid she really was. The custodian was fine. That was the first thing Duho confirmed when she called him 40 seconds after reading the message. The contact had been an approach, not an action. Someone had made inquiries about the custodian's identity and location through channels that suggested professional resourcing rather than amateur curiosity. The drive itself was untouched. The custodian had followed protocol, reported the contact immediately, and relocated to a secondary position that Duho's security had established for exactly this contingency. "She's probing," Duho said, "testing whether the custody arrangement has vulnerabilities." "Does it?" A pause that was a fraction longer than his pauses usually ran. "No." "That pause," Penelope said, "is not reassuring." "The arrangement is secure," he said. "What she's learned is that it exists and that direct access isn't available. That's useful information for her. Because it tells her the drive can't be taken, so the next move is discrediting it." Silence on his end, the specific silence of confirmation. She ended the call. Sat for a moment in the spare quiet of her apartment. The same narrow space, the same radiator, the same city outside the window that had witnessed every iteration of this situation since it began. In 48 hours, she would be in an arena. In 48 hours, the fight that had been the fixed point of every decision she had made for the past several weeks would either restore or finalize everything. And between now and then, damn Sun High was going to make a move against the recording. She could wait for it. Let Duho's infrastructure respond the way it had responded to every previous move, efficiently, effectively, always one beat behind the action rather than ahead of it. That had worked. The comeback was intact, the slot was secured, the press conference had accomplished what it needed to accomplish. But waiting had a cost. Every reactive hour was an hour Sun High spent building the next position, and a woman who had run 3 coordinated plays simultaneously without leaving a traceable fingerprint was not someone whose next move would be less sophisticated than her last. Penelope picked up her jacket. She found her through Ren. Not by asking Duho. She went directly to Ren, whom she had identified over the preceding weeks as the person in Duho's organization who held the actual information as opposed to the curated version of it. She called him from the vehicle and told him she needed Sun High's location for the next 2 hours. A pause. "Ms. Travis, Mr. Duho would want to." "I know what Mr. Duho would want," she said. "I'm asking what Sun High's schedule is." Another pause. Then, "She has a private appointment at a gallery space in the warehouse district, 41 minutes from your current position." He gave her the address with the resignation of someone who understood that his options were provide the information or be circumvented by someone determined enough to find it another way. She gave the address to the driver. The Viper was striking, and Penelope Travis had spent her entire career as the hunter, not the hunted. The gallery occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse, the kind of space that the overlap between old industrial infrastructure and new money produced in cities where both existed in sufficient quantity. The exterior was raw concrete, softened by deliberate landscaping. The interior, visible through the tall windows as she approached, was the studied minimalism of a space designed to make expensive things look inevitable. She went in through the main entrance. Sunhai was near the back of the space, in conversation with a man whose posture and cadence identified him as either the gallery owner or the artist, someone with a professional stake in her continued attention. Two members of her personal security stood at a distance that was formal rather than tactical, positioned for discretion rather than intervention. Sunhai saw her when she was 12 feet away. The conversation stopped. The gallery owner read the shift in Sunhai's attention with the instincts of someone accustomed to managing the social temperature of wealthy clients, and excused himself with the smooth, wordless efficiency of a man who had learned when to become invisible. The security took a half-step forward. Sunhai raised one hand, barely the smallest possible gesture of restraint. They stopped. She looked at Penelope with the composed, measuring attention of someone recalibrating a situation in real time. No alarm, no performance of surprise, just the steady, intelligent assessment of a woman who was never entirely unprepared, even for the things she hadn't anticipated. "This is unexpected," she said. "I know about the custodian contact," Penelope said. Her voice was level, conversational almost. "I know about Whitfield, the slot, and the commission meeting at the restaurant." She stopped 4 feet away. "I thought we should talk directly, since indirect seems to be taking up time neither of us has." Sunhai's expression didn't change. She turned slightly, setting down the glass she'd been holding on a nearby surface with the unhurried movement of someone who had decided that whatever came next deserved her full physical attention. "You came here alone," Sunhai said. "Yes." "That's either very confident or very foolish." "I've been told they can look similar from a distance," Penelope said. Something moved in Sunhai's eyes. Not amusement exactly, the recognition of a quality she hadn't expected to encounter in the form it was currently taking. She didn't punch her, she broke her spirit. "What is it you think you're going to accomplish here?" Sunhai said. Her tone had the quality of someone conducting an inquiry rather than defending a position, gathering information. Even now, under direct confrontation, the instinct was analytical. "I'm going to tell you something true," Penelope said. "And I'm going to tell it to you once, clearly, so that there's no version of this conversation where you later claim you didn't understand the terms." Sunhai waited. "The drive is secure. Whatever approach you're building toward it, discrediting the chain of custody, questioning the technical integrity of the footage, finding the custodian and applying pressure, none of it closes the case, because the drive isn't the only copy." The gallery was very quiet around them. "The original is in independent custody," Penelope continued. "A second copy went to a location outside this country 14 months ago, held by someone with no connection to me, to Duho, or to anyone in this industry. A third copy is in the possession of an attorney in a jurisdiction where the commission's reach doesn't extend, and where the disclosure agreement they pressured the original analysts to sign has no legal standing." She held Sunhai's gaze without effort. "You can move against one of those. You might even complicate two of them. But you cannot close all three before the fight, and after the fight, the value of closing them disappears entirely because the story will already be public." Sunhai said nothing. "The recording doesn't need to circulate before the fight," Penelope said. "It needs to exist. It needs to be unimpeachable. And it needs to be the thing that confirms what everyone in that arena is going to watch me prove in real time." She paused. "You moving against it now doesn't protect anything. It just adds your fingerprints to a situation that was already going to resolve without them." The silence between them had the specific texture of a room where the power geometry was shifting, and both people in it understood the direction of the shift. Sunhai looked at her. The full, direct, unguarded assessment of someone who had dropped the performance layer because the performance layer was no longer serving a function. What she was looking at was not the server from the gala, not the managed public figure from the press conference. She was looking at someone who had mapped her moves, traced her network, identified her leverage points, and walked into a room alone to deliver the findings in person with the calm of someone reporting on a situation that was already concluded. The fiancée learned her place. "You think this is about the recording," Sunhai said finally. Her voice had changed registers, quieter, with the particular quality of someone speaking from a place they don't usually speak from. "I think this started as being about the recording," Penelope said, "and the slot, and the journalist, and everything else you've been moving against for the past several weeks." A pause, "But I don't think that's what it's actually about." Sunhai's chin lifted by a degree. "He set his whiskey down," Penelope said. "At the gala, you saw it too." The gallery was absolutely still. "I'm not interested in Sang Duho," Penelope said, with the flat, unambiguous delivery of someone who understood that the clarity of a statement was its own form of power. "I'm not interested in his world, his organization, or anything that exists inside his life beyond the specific contractual arrangement that gets me back into the octagon. When the belt is back where it belongs, I'm gone. The contract closes. I walk away from every part of this, including him." Sunhai looked at her for a long moment. "You expect me to believe that," she said. "I don't expect you to believe anything," Penelope said. "I'm telling you what's true. What you do with it is your decision." She held the eye contact with the same steady, grounded quality she brought to every high-stakes room. "But I need you to understand something about the position you're currently in. Every move you've made against this comeback has been answered. Not because Duho's organization is reacting faster than you're acting, but because you're fighting a situation that has already been built to survive your interference. You're not disrupting the plan. You're documenting yourself trying to." Something shifted in Sunhai's expression. Deep, beneath the composed surface. The specific movement of a person encountering a truth they had been successfully avoiding and finding that the avoidance is no longer structurally possible. "The predator has no fear of the prey," Penelope said quietly. "You've been operating like I'm prey. I'm not. I never was. I was just in a situation that temporarily made me look like one." The silence extended. Sunhai looked away first. It was a small thing. A fraction of a second, the gaze moving to a point on the middle distance rather than holding the direct contact. In the context of any other conversation, it would have been unremarkable. In this one, it was a complete sentence. Penelope took a breath, let it out slowly. "I'm going to walk out of here and spend the next 48 hours doing the only thing that actually matters. I'd suggest you spend them deciding whether you want to be in that arena watching the outcome or whether you'd rather be somewhere else when it happens." She paused. "Either way, we're done here." She turned, walked back through the gallery, past the tall windows and the expensive things made to look inevitable, and the gallery owner who had found something to study intently at the far end of the room. Through the entrance, out into the warehouse district air. The driver had stayed. She got in, the door closed. She sat in the quiet. Her hands were completely steady. She didn't know that inside the gallery, Dam Sunhai stood exactly where she had been left. In the middle of a room full of things that cost more than most people earned in a year, with the expression of someone who had just had the architecture of a situation described to them with enough precision that the only honest response was silence. Her security waited at a respectful distance. She didn't move for a long time. When she finally reached for her phone, she held it for a moment without dialing. Then she set it back down on the surface beside her untouched glass. She didn't call the commission contact. She didn't call Whitfield. She didn't make the fourth move that she had been building toward the drive. She had looked into the eyes of a woman who had survived systematic destruction and walked back out the other side carrying the receipts. And she had recognized, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent her life reading rooms accurately, that she was standing in the presence of something she had no mechanism to dismantle. 48 hours until the fight. And for the first time since the gala, Dam Sunhai had absolutely no idea what she was going to do next, which was, For a woman who did not make mistakes, the most frightening place she had ever been. The call came at 11:47 the night before the fight. Do-ho was still at his desk. He rarely wasn't, in the hours when the city had quieted enough for the actual work to happen without the performance layer that daylight required. Ren placed the phone on the desk without explanation, which was how he communicated that the conversation required Do-ho's direct handling rather than delegation. Do-ho picked up. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Holt, regional director for the promotional entity that controlled the broadcast rights, the venue contract, and the sanctioning relationship for tomorrow's card. Holt had a reputation in the industry for being the kind of operator who understood that his value to the people above him was his willingness to make calls that those people needed made but couldn't make themselves. He was efficient, amoral, and had survived 15 years in a business that consumed people with both of those qualities by being useful enough to the right parties at the right moments. He was calling because he had been told to call. "The co-main is being pulled," Holt said. Not preamble, not diplomatic architecture. The directness of someone delivering a message they had not authored and were not responsible for. Sanctioning issue. The commission identified a procedural gap in the medical clearance filing, timeline discrepancy in the pre-fight physical documentation. The bout cannot be certified for tomorrow's card. Do-ho was quiet for a moment. "The medical clearance was filed 17 days ago," he said. "Reviewed and approved by the commission's own medical director, time-stamped and registered in their system. The commission is citing an internal audit that identified an irregularity in the filing sequence," Holt said. "They're prepared to issue a formal statement in the morning." "And the timing of this audit," Do-ho said. 17 days after approval, 14 hours before the fight." "I'm conveying the commission's position," Holt said, "not authoring it." "Who told the commission to audit?" Do-ho said. Silence on Holt's end. The silence of someone who had been explicitly instructed on the boundaries of this conversation. The board was set. Do-ho set the phone down without ending the call and looked at Ren. "Get me everything we have on the commission's medical director," he said, "and find out who contacted Holt before he contacted us." Ren was already moving. Do-ho picked the phone back up. "Mr. Holt, I'm going to need you to remain available for the next 2 hours. Don't make any additional calls regarding this matter until you hear from me again." A pause. "I have obligations too." "You have one obligation that supersedes the others," Do-ho said, "and that's ensuring that the next 12 hours don't produce a documentary record of your personal involvement in a sanctioning interference on a title card, which is currently the trajectory you're on." A measured beat. "Stay available." He ended the call. Penelope's phone rang at 12:19. She had been in the recovery state she had trained herself into before fight nights. Not sleep exactly. The shallow, alert rest of a body conserving energy, while a mind that refused to fully disengage ran its final calculations. She answered on the second ring. Do-ho's voice was the same as it always was. Flat, precise, containing information without editorializing around it. He told her about Holt's call, the medical clearance claim, the commission's stated position. He told her about the timing. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Who is it?" Not a question. The specific phrasing of someone who already understood the category of the answer and wanted only the specific name to complete the picture. "The syndicate," Do-ho said. "The promotional entity backing Vreeland's management. They have 3 people on the commission's oversight board. They've been using that access carefully, small adjustments, procedural friction, nothing traceable enough to constitute evidence on its own. Tonight they've gone further than they've gone before." "Because the press conference worked," Penelope said. "Because the press conference made the fight's narrative uncontrollable," he said. "A Vreeland win with you in the building, and the crowd knowing what they know is no longer a clean result for them. It becomes a contested outcome regardless of what happens inside the cage. They need the fight not to happen." She was quiet for a moment. "Can you fix it?" "That's why I'm calling," he said. I need you to understand what fixing it looks like tonight. It won't be clean. The methods will be the methods I use, not the methods you'd prefer. I know what methods you use, she said. Yes, he said. I wanted to confirm you understood that tonight those methods are being used on your behalf. She thought about this for exactly the time it deserved. The compromise of it. The specific transaction of accepting that the path back to something clean required passing through something that wasn't. She had made this calculation before. The night she called his number before dawn. The morning she signed the contract. Every session in the facility, every round with tours, every mile on the conditioning track had been paid for by the same calculus. Fix it, she said. No more corruption. Do-ho worked the way he worked everything, in parallel, through channels that didn't know about each other, with the patience of someone who understood that pressure applied simultaneously from multiple directions produced collapses that pressure applied sequentially never could. The first channel was Holt. Ren had identified within 20 minutes that Holt's call had been preceded by a call from a private number that routed through a communications service used by the syndicate's legal team. This made Holt not just a messenger, but a documented participant in a coordinated interference, which transformed his position from protected intermediary to exposed liability. Do-ho called him back at 12:51 and explained this transformation in the same quiet, informational register he used for everything. Holt went silent for a long moment. What do you need from me? He said. Documentation, Do-ho said. The call you received, the instruction it contained, the name of whoever authorized it. Formatted as a contemporaneous record, time-stamped, filed with your personal attorney tonight. And if I do that, then your involvement in this becomes evidence against the people who used you rather than evidence of your own participation, which is a meaningfully different legal position. A pause. You have 40 minutes. The second channel was the commission's medical director. Ren had found 3 things in the medical director's record that were useful. The first was a billing irregularity from 2 years prior involving reimbursement claims that had been quietly absorbed by the promotional entity. The second was a professional certification issue from his previous jurisdiction that had been resolved through a reference letter written by someone with syndicate connections. The third was a pending personal matter, a civil dispute involving a property transaction, where one of the parties retained counsel from a firm that Do-ho had used for certain arrangements over the years. Do-ho did not call the medical director directly. He had a conversation with a mutual acquaintance whose name appearing in the medical director's phone log would produce a specific and immediate understanding of the situation's actual dimensions. The mutual acquaintance made the call at 1:17. The medical director called Ren at 1:44 to inquire about the correct process for withdrawing a flagged audit finding. The third channel was the commission's overnight legal counsel, the attorney responsible for reviewing sanctioning decisions before they became public statements. This channel was the simplest because it required only information. Do-ho's legal team sent a single document to the overnight counsel's registered email at 1:58. A precise, 12-page analysis of the medical clearance filing, the approval timeline, the commission's own procedural standards, and the specific legal exposure created by issuing a public statement revering an approved clearance 14 hours before a sanctioned bout without documented procedural basis. The document concluded with a single paragraph, noting that the filing had been prepared with the specific anticipation of a bad faith challenge, and that the parties behind the challenge had been identified and documented. The overnight counsel called Holt at 2:23. Holt's documentation had already been filed. Do-ho called Penelope at 2:51. The fight is happening, he said. She exhaled once, slow and controlled. The clearance. Reinstated as of 2:45. The audit finding has been formally withdrawn. The commission will issue a brief correction statement in the morning citing a clerical error in the review process. A pause. Holt's documentation is in independent hands. The syndicate's board members on the commission are aware that their involvement tonight has been recorded. Will they try again in the morning? No, he said, simply, with the flat certainty of someone who had ensured that the architecture of the next several hours had no available openings. She was quiet for a moment. "Duho," she said. "Yes. After tonight, after the fight, the syndicate doesn't disappear. The commission members don't disappear. The infrastructure that made all of this possible in the first place is still standing." "Yes," he said. "The drive goes public after I win," she said. "All 3 copies simultaneously to every outlet that covered the original disqualification. That was always the plan. I need to hear you confirm it's still the plan." A pause. "It's still the plan," he said. The fight was finally happening. She set the phone down. The apartment was dark except for the city light coming through the window, the same ambient glow that had kept her company through every sleepless hour of the past 18 months. The radiator was quiet for once. The city outside moved in the particular register of 3 in the morning, sparse, unhurried, belonging to a different category of person than the daylight hours produced. Tomorrow. She lay back and looked at the ceiling and let the information of the past 3 hours settle into its proper position. The syndicate had moved. Duho had closed it. The clearance was reinstated, the card was intact, the fight was in less than 20 hours. They had tried to stop it through the medical filing. Before that, through the slot. Before that, through the journalist and the commission contact and the approach to the custodian. Every mechanism available to people who had spent years building a system that ran on the assumption of unchecked control. Every one of those mechanisms had been applied to the question of whether Penelope Travis would walk into an octagon tomorrow night. And every one of them had failed. She thought about the syndicate's board members on the commission, sitting somewhere in the city right now with the knowledge that their names were in Holt's documentation. She thought about the medical director withdrawing his audit at 2 in the morning with the haste of someone who had just fully understood the terrain. She thought about Sasha Vreeland in whatever hotel room the promotion had arranged for her, sleeping or not sleeping, knowing or not knowing what the night had contained. She thought about the recording. 3 copies in 3 locations, carrying 47 minutes of uncut footage that told the true version of a night this sport had officially decided to bury. Tomorrow night, she would add something to that footage. The sequel, the correction. Her eyes closed. The ceiling, the city, the particular quiet of a situation that had been fought for from every direction and had held. Her hands were loose at her sides, fingers open, completely relaxed. The hands that had been on championship posters. The hands that had gathered broken glass from a ballroom floor. The hands that had spent 19 days in a facility with no sign on the outside, rebuilding every weapon they had ever carried. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She had one final thought before the darkness took her, that somewhere across the city, the syndicate was awake and regrouping, and that whatever they had left in reserve, whatever move hadn't been played yet, would be waiting for her not in a boardroom or a commission office or a phone call at midnight, but inside a cage, wearing a belt with the wrong name on it. The arena smelled like it always had. Concrete and crowd, and the particular electrical charge of 50,000 people compressed into a space built for spectacle. She had forgotten this, or not forgotten exactly, but lost access to it the way you lose access to a physical sensation when enough time separates you from the last time you felt it. Standing in the tunnel now, with the crowd noise coming through the walls as a physical pressure rather than a sound, she understood that no amount of memory had preserved the actual texture of this. The memory was an outline. This was the thing itself. Nadia was to her left, running the final technical reminders in the precise, low cadence of someone who understood that the brain in the last minutes before competition needed signal, not volume. Torres was behind her, hands on her shoulders with the steady, grounding weight of someone transferring calm through contact. The security duo had assigned to the tunnel stood at intervals with the professional blankness of people doing a job that required invisibility. She breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts, hold, out through the mouth, The sequence she had run 10,000 times in training, in the dark of her apartment, in the tunnel of the MGM Grand before the fight that had been taken from her. The sequence that built a wall between the noise outside and the stillness required inside. Her hands were wrapped, gloves on, body moving through the preparatory rhythm of a fighter in the final minutes before the cage door. She wasn't fighting for money. She was fighting for her soul. The walk was different this time. The last time she had made this walk, it had felt like arrival, the culmination of a linear progression from training room to regional circuit to main card to this, the center of the sport's largest stage. Everything pointing forward in one clean direction. This walk felt like return. The music hit when she cleared the tunnel entrance, and the crowd's response was not the standard reception of a fighter making a walkout. It was something else. Layered. The people who knew her history, and there were more of them than the syndicate had counted on, because the press conference had done what press conferences did when the story underneath them was true. Were on their feet with the specific energy of witnesses who had been waiting to see something corrected. She walked through it without performing for it. Eyes forward, pace controlled. The same economy of movement she had brought to every room since the gala, the fundamental decision to never spend more than the moment required. The cage was at the end of the walkway. It looked exactly like every cage she had ever entered. Exactly like the one in Duho's facility, where she had spent 19 days rebuilding. Exactly like the one where a referee had waved off a fight she was standing through, and a rival had turned and smiled with the specific knowledge of someone who had been told the ending in advance. She climbed the steps. The roar of the crowd was back. Here's something worth understanding before we go further. In combat sports, the mental and physical preparation for a fight happens in two completely separate tracks that have to eventually converge. The physical track is measurable: conditioning, technical sharpness, grappling defense, cardio base. Coaches can assess it, adjust it, confirm it against objective standards. The mental track is different. It can't be measured from the outside. It's the fighter's private work, the management of fear, the conversion of anger into fuel rather than noise, the ability to enter a high-stakes environment and find the stillness inside the pressure rather than being consumed by it. The fighters who lose fights they should win almost always lose on the mental track first. The body follows the mind into defeat before a single punch is thrown. What you're about to watch Penelope do inside that cage is both tracks operating at full capacity simultaneously, which is rarer than most people realize, and why most careers never produce more than 1 or 2 nights like this one. Subscribe, hit like, and let's get into the fight. Vreeland entered to a reception that was louder in volume, but different in character. The crowd noise for Vreeland had the quality of obligation, the acknowledgement of a champion, a title holder, the person holding the object that the narrative required her to give back. It wasn't cold. It wasn't hostile. It was simply honest, and honesty in an arena full of people who had watched a press conference was a particular kind of pressure that no amount of promotional management could fully neutralize. Vreeland moved through her walkout with the contained, professional composure of a fighter who had been prepared for a hostile reception and had decided to metabolize it as motivation. Her team was full, coordinated, surrounding her with the organized energy of a camp that had resources and had used them. When she climbed into the cage and turned to find Penelope already there, already still, already watching her with that quality of presence that carried its full weight even across 30 feet of cage mat, something passed across Vreeland's face in the fraction of a second before she locked it down. Penelope saw it. The debt, still there, 18 months of compound interest. The referee, a different one, a detailed Duho had ensured through legitimate channels with the quiet thoroughness he brought to every controllable variable, brought them to the center for the final instructions. She looked at Vreeland at close range, the sweat already on her temples from the walkout heat. The way her weight shifted, a barely perceptible rhythm, the body's management of pre-fight adrenaline. She found Vreeland's tell immediately. The right shoulder, 2 centimeters, still there. 18 months, a full promotional machine, all the resources of a syndicate-backed camp. And the tell that Penelope had cataloged across 4 months of footage study had survived all of it intact. The referee stepped back. The cage door closed. The first round was geometry. Penelope moved the way she had moved in Duho's facility in the final week, with the sharpened, ahead-of-itself quality that Nadia had identified and built into the game plan's foundation. She controlled distance with the footwork that Tors had drilled into reflex, kept the center of the cage, made Vreeland chase angles that didn't resolve cleanly into combinations. Vreeland was good. This was the honest assessment, processed in real time without sentiment. She was rangy, composed, technically sound, and had the specific toughness of a fighter who had been in title fights before and understood that the early rounds belonged to patience rather than ambition. But she was fighting someone who had studied her in the particular way that only comes from having a very specific, very personal reason to understand every flaw in another fighter's game. The overhand came in the second minute. The shoulder dropped. Penelope wasn't there, already moving laterally, the counter already leaving before the conscious decision to throw it had fully formed. The right hand landed on Vreeland's temple with the clean, sharp impact of something that had been prepared for at the cellular level. Vreeland moved, absorbed it, reset. But the crowd felt the exchange, and what the crowd felt shifted the room's atmosphere by another degree in the direction it had been moving since Penelope walked out of that tunnel. The second round was attrition. Penelope accumulated. The system she had built her career on, the surgical patience of a striker who understood that a fight was a long argument and that being consistently right mattered more than being occasionally spectacular, operated at the level it had reached in the final days of camp. Precise, economical, each exchange leaving a deposit that compounded across the minutes. Vreeland adjusted. She was too experienced not to. She shortened her combinations, changed her entry angles, tried to impose the clinch work that her camp had clearly emphasized as a pathway to disrupting Penelope's rhythm. Tors' work held. The defensive wrestling was functional, not elegant, but functional at exactly the threshold required. By the end of the second round, Vreeland's left eye carried the beginning of swelling that Penelope recognized from footage. The specific location where the accumulated jab damage gathered and eventually became a structural problem for the overhand she relied on. Between rounds, Nadia said 4 words, "You're winning, keep winning." The third round changed. Not because of anything Penelope did wrong. Because Vreeland, facing the specific mathematics of a fight slipping away from her in a setting where losing meant more than losing, made the decision that desperate fighters make when the game plan has failed and the clock is running. She went for broke. The combination that came in the 3rd minute of the round was the most dangerous thing Vreeland had thrown all night. Full commitment, full weight transfer. The right hand that had ended 2 of her previous defenses thrown, with everything her camp had spent 18 months building into it. It landed. Not cleanly. Penelope had read the setup 2 exchanges early and had already begun the defensive adjustment, so what landed was a partial version of what Vreeland had thrown, enough to register, enough to produce the brief, electric blankness that a hard punch delivers to the brain's operational clarity. She went to a knee. The arena noise changed into something vast and undifferentiated. The referee moved in. She could see him in the peripheral of her narrowed vision, moving with the procedural pace of someone conducting a count rather than the rehearsed speed of someone executing a script. She was on a knee on the canvas of a title fight. The count started. She thought about nothing. The count was not a thought. The count was a physical fact. The canvas under her glove was not a thought. The ringing in her left ear was not a thought. These were just the current conditions of the environment, and the environment had conditions she had navigated before and conditions she had not, and none of that mattered because the body underneath her was not finished and the mind above it had not left. At 6 she assessed. At 7 she decided. At 8 she stood. Both feet, weight balanced, hands up, eyes tracking, the full vocabulary of a fighter who was present, functional, and absolutely entitled to continue. The referee looked at her and stepped back. The final round. The fourth round was something she would spend the rest of her career being asked to describe and never fully being able to. It was not fury, not the explosive, adrenaline-driven response of a fighter who had been hurt and was compensating with emotion. It was the opposite, a clarification. The knockdown had stripped the last layer of calculation from the situation and left something underneath that was older and cleaner than strategy. She knew Vreeland's right shoulder. She knew the swollen eye. She knew the timing pattern that had emerged across 3 rounds of exchanges, the specific rhythm of Vreeland's reset between combinations, the window that opened and closed in the half-second after her feet reset from a lateral movement. She waited for it. It opened. The combination she threw had been built in a facility with no sign on the outside, rebuilt from a foundation that 18 months of invisibility had somehow refined rather than destroyed, and delivered with the accumulated weight of a title stolen, a recording preserved, a comeback navigated through every kind of interference that money and influence and a system designed to protect itself could deploy. 4 strikes. The sequence that had finished 11 of 32 stoppages. 30 milliseconds ahead of itself. Vreeland went down. She didn't get up. The referee waved it off, cleanly, correctly, with the unambiguous finality of a decision that had no other available interpretation. And the arena became a sound that Penelope had heard once before, in a different building, 18 months ago, before a different referee had made a different kind of decision. 50,000 people. She wasn't fighting for money. She had never been fighting for money. The belt came over her shoulder, the weight of it, the specific physical reality of the object after the abstraction of it for so long, and she stood in the center of the cage with the lights and the noise and the full, overwhelming, completely earned confirmation that the thing that had been taken was no longer missing. She looked up at the mezzanine level of the arena. Duho was there, still, watching with the contained expression of a man whose investment had just confirmed its value. He gave her the smallest nod, the private acknowledgement of a concluded transaction. Beside him, 2 rows back, she could see the edge of a figure in the shadows. Sun high. She had come after all. The belt felt heavier this time, and somewhere in the arena's upper level, a woman who had spent weeks trying to prevent this moment was watching the crowd roar for the champion she had never been able to stop. And the recording that would dismantle everything was already in motion toward 3 separate inboxes, carrying 47 minutes of truth that had been waiting 18 months for exactly this night. The post-fight room had the specific quality of aftermath. Not celebration, that had happened in the cage, in the tunnel, in the compressed minutes between the stoppage and the walk back through the arena corridors, where the noise followed her like a physical thing, and the people lining the barriers reached through for contact with the specific urgency of an audience that had witnessed something they understood was real. That was finished now. What remained was quieter and more permanent. She sat on the treatment table with the belt across her thighs and let the medical team do their work. The post-fight examination that was procedural and thorough and entirely beside the point of everything she was actually processing. The physician checked her pupils, assessed the site where Vreeland's right hand had landed in the third, confirmed what her body had already told her. Functional, intact, present. Nadia stood against the wall with her arms crossed and the expression of someone who had delivered a result and was now privately recalibrating what came next. Tors was in the corner, already on his phone, already moving into the next thing with the forward momentum of a man for whom completed work was simply the ground the next work stood on. Cecilia appeared in the doorway at 12 minutes past the hour. 3 outlets want immediate post-fight. I've scheduled 2. The third is the one we discussed. Penelope looked at her. The investigative piece. They received the first copy of the recording 40 minutes ago, Cecilia said. Their legal team is reviewing. They want a statement to accompany publication. The belt felt heavier this time. She had thought about this moment across the entire length of the camp. Not the fight itself. The fight had been the object of every physical and technical hour she had invested. But this The moment after. The moment when the belt was back and the recording was moving, and the thing she had been carrying for 18 months was no longer a private burden, but a public fact in the process of becoming undeniable. She had expected to feel something uncomplicated. Relief, maybe. The clean emotional resolution of a long and difficult story arriving at its correct ending. What she actually felt was more precise than that. Not relief, clarity. The difference between carrying a weight and setting it down was not the absence of the weight. It was the sudden, complete awareness of how long you had been carrying it, how thoroughly it had shaped the way you moved through every room, every conversation, every decision. Clarity was what arrived when the shaping pressure lifted, and you could finally see the outline it had left. She picked up the belt, looked at it. Metal and leather. The physical object that a sport had decided was worth corrupting its own integrity to redirect. The thing that had cost her 18 months of invisibility, 3 jobs, a narrow apartment, and a warehouse confrontation with a woman who had deployed every available instrument of obstruction against her return. She set it back across her thighs. "Schedule the investigative piece for tonight," she said. Do-ho arrived at the post-fight room 22 minutes after the stoppage. He came alone, no security, no intermediaries, which she had come to understand was his specific way of signaling that what followed was a direct conversation rather than a managed one. He closed the door. The room contracted to the two of them, and the particular atmosphere of a concluded arrangement reaching its final accounting. "The broadcaster is already in contact with the promotion," he said. "The commission statement about tonight's officiating is being drafted. Holt's documentation has been shared with 2 additional outlets beyond the investigative piece." He paused. "The syndicate's board members are aware that their names appear in it." "How aware?" she said. "Aware enough that 2 of them have already retained separate counsel," he said, "which is its own form of confirmation." She nodded, looked at her hands. "The contract closes tonight," he said. "As written. You retain the belt, the promotional rights revert, the training arrangement concludes with the end of the camp." A measured pause. Everything inside the contract's defined terms. She didn't work for them. They worked for her. There was a quality to this moment that she wanted to hold accurately, not sentimentalize, not reduce. Do-ho had used her return as an investment, had applied methods she couldn't fully endorse to a problem she couldn't solve alone, had operated throughout with the detached, strategic intelligence of a man for whom other people's situations were primarily variables in a larger calculation. None of that had changed. But he had also kept every term of the contract. In an environment where every institution she had approached had eventually bent to pressure or self-interest, he had held the arrangement's architecture intact against the full weight of the syndicate's interference, Sunhigh's parallel campaign, and the commission's final-hour attempt to pull the clearance. Not from loyalty. From the specific integrity of a man whose word, once given in a binding context, was the foundation everything else he built stood on. She understood the distinction. It mattered. "The recording goes public tonight," she said. "All 3 copies as planned." "Already in motion," he said. "The custodian released simultaneously with Cecilia's delivery to the investigative outlet. The 3rd copy publishes in 4 hours through the international outlet we identified in the pre-fight planning." He looked at her with the same flat, measuring attention he had brought to every exchange since the ballroom. "By morning, there will be nothing left to suppress." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said, simply, without elaboration or qualification, because the transaction had been what it had been, and the outcome had been what it had been, and some things were true without being complicated. He nodded once. The door opened behind him. Cecilia, managing the timeline with her usual atmospheric precision. "First outlet in 5 minutes." Do-ho moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "Travis." She looked at him. "The next fight," he said, "if you ever want the infrastructure again." "I'll find you," she said. He left. "Before we get to the final reckoning, if this story has meant something to you, if Penelope's comeback has felt like more than fiction, take a second to understand why. The sports corruption at the center of this story isn't invented from nothing. Conflicts of interest between athletic commissions and the promotions they regulate are real and documented. Fighters, real ones, not fictional, have had careers derailed by officiating decisions that independent analysts have questioned and that institutions have protected rather than examined. The difference between Penelope's story and those real stories is that she had something most fighters don't: leverage, documentation, and an alliance powerful enough to force the system to answer. Most fighters don't get that. The ones who come closest are the ones with communities behind them, audiences who pay attention, who demand transparency, who make suppression costly. That's not nothing. Subscribe, share this story, and remember that the most powerful thing a witness can do is refuse to look away. The investigative interview ran 40 minutes. She said everything she had been carrying, not with the performed emotion of someone who had rehearsed their grievance for public consumption, but with the flat, documented precision of someone who had spent 18 months organizing facts into an order that could not be reasonably disputed. The timeline, the filing, the approval, the analysts' initial conclusions and their subsequent retractions, the commission's relationships with the promotional entity, the recording's existence, its content, its chain of custody. The journalist, careful, experienced, asking the questions of someone who had reviewed the footage and understood its implications. Let her speak without interruption, except where clarification genuinely served the record. When it was finished, she walked out of the interview room and into the corridor where Cecilia was waiting with the post-fight logistics that still required management. She moved through them: the second outlet, the promotional obligations, the arena's internal procedures, with the contained efficiency of someone who had one more thing remaining and was holding space for it. She found Sunhai in the arena's upper concourse. Not by accident. Ren had tracked the movement, and Cecilia had quietly built a 15-minute window into the schedule that nobody had explained the purpose of. Penelope had understood its purpose without being told. The concourse was largely cleared by now, the post-fight crowd having filtered into the parking structure and the surrounding streets. Sunhai stood at the railing overlooking the arena floor, where the octagon was being broken down by the venue crew, the systematic dismantling of the night's architecture into its component parts, the cage becoming components, the canvas being rolled, the lighting being redirected toward the ordinary business of a building returning to its default state. She heard Penelope approach, didn't turn immediately. When she did, her expression had none of the architecture it usually carried. The composed, managing, strategically deployed presentation was absent. What remained was simpler, and, in its simplicity, more human than anything Penelope had seen from her across the full length of their collision. She looked tired. Not physically. The specific tiredness of someone who had deployed every available resource against a situation and had watched every one of those deployments fail, and who was now standing in the aftermath with the exhaustion of effort that produced nothing it aimed at. "You came," Penelope said. "I almost didn't," Sunhai said. They stood at the railing together. Below them, the crew worked in the efficient, impersonal way of people doing a job that existed independently of whatever had happened in the space they were now disassembling. "The recording will be everywhere by morning," Penelope said, not as a threat, as information delivered with the same directness she had brought to the warehouse. "I know," Sunhai said. "The commission members whose names are in the documentation will be managing that by morning as well." A pause. "Duho's involvement will come out eventually. The nature of the arrangement will be visible to anyone who looks." Sunhai was quiet for a moment. "And you," she said, "what does it look like for you?" A fighter who was wrongfully disqualified reclaimed her title and exposed the corruption that facilitated the original decision, Penelope said. "With assistance from a private investor whose methods are his own business and whose contract with me has concluded." "Clean," Sunhai said, with a quality that was not quite bitterness and not quite admiration. "Earned," Penelope said. "The kingmaker and the queen." Sunhai looked down at the arena floor for a long moment. The octagon was nearly gone, the frame disassembled, the canvas folded, the space it had occupied becoming ordinary floor again. "He respects you," she said, quietly, with the specific difficulty of someone saying a true thing they have spent considerable energy avoiding. "He respects what I did," Penelope said. "That's different, and it's enough." She turned slightly toward Sunhai. "You know the difference between those two things better than most people do." Something passed across Sunhai's face. The recognition of being seen accurately, not cruelly, not with satisfaction, but with the plain honesty of someone who had no remaining investment in managing the impression. "What happens now?" Sunhai said. "To you?" "I defend the belt," Penelope said. "On my terms with my team, through legitimate promotional arrangements that don't require anyone's shadow infrastructure to function." She paused. "The sport has a corruption problem that one recording and one fight won't fully dismantle, but it's a start. And starts have a way of becoming things when the people involved don't stop." She picked up the belt from where she had set it on the railing beside her. Looked at it one more time. The weight of it, the specific physical reality of the object and everything it represented and everything it had cost. "Go home, Sunhai," she said, not unkindly. She left her at the railing. Walked back through the concourse toward the exit, the belt in her hand, the city waiting outside, the recording already moving through the channels that would make the morning different from every morning that had preceded it. She didn't need their permission. She never had. She pushed through the door. The belt was home. The truth was in motion. And Penelope Travis walked into the night as the only thing she had ever been, and the one thing they had spent 18 months trying to convince the world she wasn't, the champion.